Power.
Autopilot.
Bank angle.
Autopilot.
Approach 1594 to chart approach, ready speaker 170,
Autopilot.
bank angle. Holy shit. So fucking die.
On January 13, 1982, an Air Florida Boeing 737 fell from a snowy sky and crashed into the 14th Street Bridge in Washington, D.C., plunging 79 passengers and the crew into the frozen Potomac River in front of the Pentagon. In the hours following the accident, a group of rescuers tirelessly struggled to save a handful of survivors clinging to life amid the wreckage. However, Flight 90 did not escape a long list of air disasters that have remained etched in people's minds. As if that weren't enough, the most terrifying aspect is how the desperation leading up to the catastrophe has been recorded in the black box of that aircraft. Words laden with anguish and difficult to forget. In this new military aviation video, we will review 3 terrible accidents where we can also hear from the individuals involved just before their tragic end. Flight 90 Air Florida. Our first case will be the mentioned Air Florida Flight 90, remembered as a turning point in how the industry addressed the issue of snow and ice. That American winter day featured a strong storm battering the Atlantic when a Boeing 737-200 from the company arrived at Washington National Airport. Due to the snowfall that had occurred by then, it was one of the last flights to land before the runway was closed for snow removal. The crew was informed that they estimated the snow removal would take at least an hour before resuming air traffic. The message reached the 2 Air Florida pilots, Captain Larry Wheaton, 34 years old, and First Officer Roger Pettit, 31 years old. Neither of the two had much experience with aircraft like the one they were commanding that day. Although Wheaton had a respectable 8,300 flight hours, most of them were in light aircraft. He had started flying for the company in 1979 when Air Florida bought his former employer, and since then, he had accumulated only about 1,200 hours on the company's aircraft before being promoted to captain in August 1980. That was much less than what could be expected at major airlines, where pilots spent an average of 14 years as first officers before moving to the captain's seat. Pettit, on the other hand, had even less experience. Most of his 3,350 hours were accumulated flying F-15s in the military, and he only had 992 hours in air transport operations. While this was not necessarily a determining factor in foreseeing an accident, the actions of a more experienced pilot often contribute to avoiding certain consequences, as would unfold on this fateful day. Due to the airport closure, the departure of Air Florida Flight 90 to Tampa and then to Fort Lauderdale was delayed. Initially, the departure from Washington was scheduled for 14:15, but operations would only resume at 14:30. The captain informed the de-icing truck operator that he wanted them to apply anti-icing fluid to the plane just before the airport reopened, to be ready to depart as soon as the runway was cleared. This process is carried out to keep all aircraft exposed to accumulating ice or snow on their surfaces free of contamination. On that day, the mixture used as an anti-icing agent was not too concentrated, but it was suitable for the temperature. Below, we can see part of that process. Finally, due to further delays, the airport resumed its activity at 14:53, but the truck responsible for towing the plane backward so it could start taxiing had trouble performing its task due to ice on the runway, causing new delays. Problems seemed to keep piling up, but when the clock struck 15:38, it was time to depart. The pilots started the plane's engines and proceeded to execute the actions specified in the procedure checklist. One of the items indicated checking the engine's anti-ice system. As they reached that point, the crew made sure it was turned off and continued with the following steps. Considering that both the captain and the first officer generally flew in warm climates where the anti-ice system should not be used, and knowing that they had little experience in flights with weather conditions similar to that day in Washington, it is speculated that both performed the action routinely. The problem was that on that day, it was necessary to activate the system to prevent certain sensors that measure engine parameters from freezing. However, the pilots unconsciously left it off out of habit. Under those circumstances, taxiing on the runway began, and the 737 joined the line of planes waiting to take off. While waiting for their turn, the captain talked to his first officer about the time elapsed since the plane had been sprayed with anti-icing fluid, as an hour of the process was about to be completed due to the delays. They managed to observe the tips of the wings and noticed that they had already accumulated a considerable amount of snow, so they considered what measures to take. It was appropriate to leave the line of planes and return to be sprayed with anti-icing fluid again, but that meant losing position and delaying the flight's departure too much. For that reason, Wheaton came up with a terrible idea. He positioned the Boeing on the taxiway, intending for the exhaust gases from another aircraft's turbines to melt and remove the snow from the wings. The result of that maneuver was decisive in the fate of Air Florida Flight 90. The hot air expelled by the engines of an M9 aircraft in front effectively melted the snow but left the wings covered with water that, in contact with the cold surface, eventually turned into ice. This added a second determining factor before starting the takeoff, for which optimal power had been calculated, something commonly done to reduce engine wear. The catastrophe began there. The pilots accelerated until the power indicator reached the desired value, but in reality, the one marked was lower than the actual value because, with the anti-ice system not turned on, the turbine sensor had frozen and did not provide accurate data. They began to notice an unusual performance, but confused by the unfamiliar weather, they continued to rely on the parameters and believed it was a normal occurrence for engines on a cold day. However, they soon began to have difficulty maintaining the ascent rate, and the aircraft vibrated intensely, symptoms of a loss of lift. They lowered the nose of the aircraft, but lost altitude rapidly, and when they realized the danger of the action, they accelerated the engines to their maximum power. The last attempts to survive were recorded in the black box recordings. By that time, it was already too late, and the 737 could not recover. It ended up crashing into the bridge and falling into the frozen Potomac River. Of the 74 passengers and 5 crew members on board, 70 passengers and 4 crew members died, including the captain and the first officer. In addition, another 4 people in vehicles on the bridge lost their lives, and several were injured. The aftermath of the accident was truly shocking. Dan Air Flight 1008. The next case takes us to April 25, 1980, when Dan Air's defunct Flight 1008 was heading from Manchester to Tenerife. Unlike the episode in the United States, the cockpit of the Boeing 727 had a wealth of experience at the controls. The captain and pilot were Arthur John Whalen, 50 years old, who had previously flown to Tenerife Norte Airport 58 times. He had 15,299 flight hours, including 1,912 hours on the 727. Additionally, he was accompanied by the first officer Michael John Firth, who had also flown to the destination airport 9 times, and flight engineer Raymond John Carey. However, all the experience could not escape a possible miscommunication from the air traffic controller to the Boeing crew, a factor found as one of the main causes of what was about to happen. It is believed that the instructions given to the captain about the route were not concise, leading him to perform a maneuver without clarity and not defined at all. This possible confusion or lack of understanding with the controller triggered a series of actions with serious consequences. After discussions among the occupants of the plane's cabin, a sudden left turn occurred. The pilot did not realize the low altitude until the dangerous terrain warning alarm began to sound, and he had to make a violent right turn to compensate for the error. The additional problem was a dense sea of clouds that prevented a clear view and had contributed to putting the aircraft in a delicate situation. Despite the crew's efforts to bring the Boeing to a high-terrain area, it was too late. Flight 1008 collided with Mount El Diablillo in the municipality of El Rosario, 20 kilometers from Los Rodeos Airport, its destination. Once again, the black box recording is striking. A search group quickly formed, bringing together members of the Civil Guard, the National Police, the Army, the Red Cross, and the Fire Department. When they reached the site of the tragic accident, they dedicated themselves to searching for survivors, but the scene did not offer the possibility of finding anyone alive. In total, there were 146 fatalities. The search continued for several more days, but in this case, the goal was to recover the passengers' bodies and identify them for delivery to their families. The difficulty in achieving this speaks clearly of the severity of the accident. Comair Flight 3272. The last case places us on January 9, 1997, and leads us to a fatal accident that occurred for reasons similar to the previous two. An Embraer EMB-120RT operated by Comair Airlines was responsible for performing Flight 3272 from Cincinnati/Northern Kentucky International Airport to Detroit Metropolitan Wayne County Airport. After a departure delayed due to service and de-icing requirements, the journey proceeded without incidents until arriving in the terminal area in Detroit. The controller at the airport requested an airspeed reduction to 350 km per hour and a descent to an altitude of 2,100 meters. After leveling off, the crew received instructions to further reduce speed and altitude. First, decelerate to 315 km per hour, and then to 270. Descend to 1,800 meters and subsequently to 1,200. The following instructions were to turn to the right on a heading of 180 degrees, and about 40 seconds later, a left turn to a heading of 90 degrees was requested. All these movements were carried out without either party taking into account precautions for the weather conditions they were facing. Suddenly, in the cockpit, they began to notice that something was wrong. The aircraft's roll increased beyond what was necessary to take the correct heading, and the speed dropped considerably, causing the nose of the plane to pitch downward. Desperation can be heard once again in the recordings leading up to the impact.
Yeah, like your low speed indicator. Power.
Autopilot.
Bank angle.
Autopilot.
Request 1594 to Detroit approach, reduce speed to 170, mate.
Autopilot.
Holy shit.
The Embraer of Flight 3272 ended up crashing into the ground in a field in a rural area 35 kilometers from Detroit Airport. The plane was destroyed by the forces of the impact against the ground and the subsequent post-accident fire, and its fragments were found inside and around 3 craters. The 26 passengers and 3 crew members died instantly. Finally, the investigation determined that a combination of ice accumulation on the wings and low speed with retracted flaps caused adverse effects on both lift and drag. That led to a loss of control after the autopilot disconnected when attempting to land. Thus, the aircraft entered an extreme nose-down pitch attitude from which the crew could not recover. Coming to the end of our video, we must understand that the likelihood of an airplane having an accident during a trip is much lower than that faced by land vehicles every day. However, when they do happen, they are horrifying, as demonstrated by the last words of the protagonists themselves. Now, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for accompanying us until the end. And stay tuned to our channel to reunite in the next video.